the Why We See Movies podcast. I am your host, Ron Houghton. Joining me as always is Paul.
Boo!
And Ivan. And Darren.
Why, hello, Ron.
Today we are going to be talking about our favorite horror films. So sit back and enjoy.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
I want to play a game. There was a child. I want to know where that child came from.
He has his father's eyes.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
I see dead people.
The blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
You're going to need a bigger boat. It is time to keep your appointment with the Wicker Man.
Can I have a piece of toast?
God, I love you.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
Children of the night, what music they make.
Red rum.
Well, I'm Pennywise the dancing clown.
It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
Actually, brooding for this girl. She's got so much heart. Think of all the pain and the heart.
Tequila is my lady! My lady!
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Look at me, Damien. It's all for you. They're here.
To the box! Who's in the bar? What's in the bar?
Have you checked the children?
All right, today we're going to be talking about horror movies. Dexter, thanks for joining us. Glad you could participate today.
For sure.
Now, I thought the best way to tackle such a massive subject like this would be to just go back and look at the history of horror films in general. I know Darren and I are a little more versed in some of the classics than Paul and Ivan, but you guys can chime in when you can. And then later on, we'll move into some of the newer horror films that are all-time favorites. But before we begin, I would like to ask you guys a simple question. What do you guys think makes a movie a horror movie?
That's an interesting question to ask.
Mm-hmm.
The obvious thing should be the scares. I gotta say for me personally that very little actually scares me, quote unquote scares.
The difference between the two types of scares, I guess, would be the jump scare,
which
would make you just jump in your seat for a second.
Sure, and you can get anyone to jump in their seat with the right shock.
Mm-hmm. And then there's, of course, a general sense of dread or getting under your skin, which is far more rare.
Exactly. And being an atheist who doesn't believe in anything metaphysical or supernatural, outside of the realm of science as we know it, I don't believe in ghosts or vampires or spirits or anything like that. So to get supernatural things to scare me in a movie is kind of tough. And for me, the best way to do it is a good sense of atmosphere. Like if you can build strong sense of tension and suspense within the right atmosphere, then I can be scared. And there's some classic examples of that, and there's some very good recent examples of that I'd like to talk a little bit about.
Right. Paul?
For me, it's got to have the right tone and has to have characters that you root for and cheer for. And that can be the villain, too. I mean, a good horror movie, you can be cheering for the villain. It's kind of like any movie. Ron, you and I recently talked about it, and we were talking about how so many people thought it was scary. And neither you or I thought it was that scary, but it was very character-driven, and it was just a really good story. It was a well-made movie. And those are the ones that land for me, are the ones that, the overall quality is there. I mean, I've really outgrown a lot of the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Streets that I grew up on and instigated my love of the genre, but I'd say my tastes have moved on from them for sure.
For me, I would say intelligence probably has a lot to do with it because there's so many, like you brought up Elm Street and Friday the 13th. A lot of those movies only happen because everybody in it is so fucking stupid.
So you're talking about what makes a good horror movie.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm saying like intelligence, where the actually movies make sense to me. That's what I kind of look forward to, especially if it's at a kind of real world where you can kind of be like, that could actually happen. That's what I look forward to.
And it has nothing to do with, I know a lot of people judge horror films by how grotesque they can be.
No, many modern audiences would say, oh, it was scary because of all the blood and guts in it. For me, the scariest movies, elicited the most chills for me have not had a ton of blood and guts in them. And
I would agree with that. All of my favorite horror movies are the ones that are making you think while you're watching them, as opposed to just waiting for the next big jump. I mean, because for me, most jump scares don't really work that well. And like maybe 95% of them don't work because they're so telegraphed.
Audiences are so sophisticated these days, and sure, it's fun to get a good jump scare once in a while. It's fun for the filmmakers and it's fun for the audience. But we know when we're expecting one because of the filmmakers are using the exact same modes of delivery that they have for decades. That hasn't changed. If you want to get a good jump scare, you got to have a mundane situation, but one that doesn't feel like, okay, why am I all of a sudden watching this mundane situation? I mean, in Jaws, when Roy Scheider is chumming out the fish bits behind the orca, and he's genuinely talking and complaining to the other guys, and it feels right for the scene. So when that shark pops out, that's a good, genuine shock moment, and it works.
And it's shot at such a specific angle that there's not too much sea, so you're not focusing on
on
the negative.
That's a good point.
You're still on Scheider for the whole scene.
Right.
And I would think as jump scares go in recent ones, you're right, you can really only get away with them once. Like Samuel Jackson's one from Deep Blue Sea. Remember that?
Yeah.
That can work once in a movie to great effect.
Yeah.
And then after that, you can almost see it coming ahead of time because someone's going to steal that idea.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's not even a horror movie. So plenty of movies can have jump scares without necessarily being labeled what you would think of as a horror film.
Exactly. Yeah. And another good moment would be Jack Nicholson coming from around the post in The Shining and taking care of poor old Scatman Crothers, which I don't even know if I'd want to call that a jump scare. Like it is and it isn't. I mean, it certainly surprises you the first time you see it, but he didn't direct it like a jump scare, though, and I don't think he meant it as a jump scare. I'll put it that way. And
like Spielberg always said, he could have had one of the greatest jump scares of all time when Shelley Duvall is going through all the papers of what makes Jack a dull boy, and it's kind of a low shot looking up at her. And if Jack were to appear over her shoulder, all of a sudden it would have been wow. But he went the opposite way and had, from Jack's point of view, watching her.
Yeah, slowly approaching her from across the room, which is probably profoundly more scary.
A classier way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Classy is a good way to put it. Kubrick is far too classy a filmmaker just to load up even a horror movie with jump scares.
Right. But of course, a horror film could cover many genres too, right?
Oh, definitely.
Most people might consider, supernatural, ghost stories, slasher films to be what horror films are. The bulk of what horror movies would be generally thought of being.
Yeah.
But what about Alien?
And that's exactly what I thought. Yeah.
What about Seven?
Silence of the Lambs.
Absolutely, right.
You can even have Ghostbusters. That sure the material is there, and sure it's a comedy at its heart, but it's got some pretty dark material in there.
But getting back to what I was saying, like Jaws is a perfect example. I always think of Jaws as an adventure film. I love Jaws, and it's one of my top 20 movies of all time.
Yeah, maybe
but when
top
I
10
think of
for
my
me.
top horror films of all time, it doesn't register.
No, and a lot of people would consider it horror, and certainly growing up in the 80s as you and I did, we definitely have been in a lot of video stores where you see Jaws in the horror section. But yeah, I mean, it was directed like kind of a seafaring adventure. And for me, it works mostly as suspense more than anything. I can see why people would call it a horror film, but I can't quite classify that myself as a horror.
Two more of my favorites. I would consider the first Alien movie to fall into a horror movie, yet Alien's not. It's more of an action movie.
If I had to define Alien, I'd probably have to call it horror. And Aliens, probably I'd have to call it, just like you, action more than sci-fi or horror.
So it's a very fine line even between movies in the same series.
For sure, yeah.
Right.
Sorry, just because you brought up Seven, this is completely off topic, but guess what Gwyneth Paltrow's Halloween costume this year was?
Not the head in the box.
She put a box around her head with the whole fragile, and her boyfriend or whatever was dressed up like the convict with the handcuffs.
It took her this long to come up with that.
Her publicist came up with it, let's be honest.
But still, I thought that was pretty awesome.
That is awesome.
Saw a picture, she just like had the box on her head.
Yeah, that's her claim to fame for sure. The most famous head in a box in movie history.
But just because you brought that up, I thought I'd mention it.
But it's funny you do mention Seven because it's one of my all-time favorite movies of any genre, and it's not one that immediately leaps out to me as horror,
Absolutely.
But I can totally see it.
But all the ones we've been naming, from Jaws to Alien to Silence of the Lambs to Seven, these are all some of my favorite movies. But when I think of a horror film, none of them come to mind. None of them jump out to me.
Because I think these days when you think of horror movies, you're thinking slasher movies.
No, or The Shining.
You're expecting certain elements.
Certain things, exactly. Certain things, I guess, atmosphere, opposed to some movies, I guess, that just have horrific scenes or horrific elements to it. I'm thinking of movies that I guess are generally consistent of a horror film. The whole movie is a horror movie.
Horror, kind of almost like comedy. It's so personal, right? Like action movies, anybody is going to identify with, oh, well, that was a kick-ass action scene. But horror, it's so personal. Like it. So many people find that scary, but it just didn't land with me as far as the scary elements go. But something else, something that like a Blair Witch Project, which a lot of people kind of pan and don't like. I love it for the same reasons they hate it, where, oh, it doesn't show much. And for me, sometimes what you can conjure up in your head is far more frightening than what they can put on the screen.
Kind of like the whole Signs, right? From M. Night Shyamalan back in the day, where they didn't really show any of the aliens. Everything that happened was happening off screen, kind of making your mind wonder what's going on.
Something that kind of chills you to the soul that you're thinking of like a day or two afterwards. Kind of like when we were talking about It Comes at Night. Sure, it might not be your traditional horror, but the more you think about it and the more you ponder it and the more like we discussed it, the more, settles in and lands a little bit more.
Psychological horror.
Yeah. And I think that the slasher movies can land well when they're done bit differently, right?
For a lot of moviegoers, it has its day. Now, out of all the genres in movies, I think horror is the one that you really kind of grow up with. All teenagers have a tendency towards the bloody, kind of disgusting horror films that you just want to see them.
With the co-ed in the shower. Sure.
And it's kind of, the more you're growing up you get and the more adult you get, the more adult you want your horror film to be. Less gore and more
substance.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's true.
Because I loved a lot of terrible horror movies when I was a kid.
Yeah, me too.
You could watch just about anything as long as it had a certain amount of blood and guts and sex.
Yeah.
It made the grade.
Yeah.
Well, and even something like Waxwork, the original Waxwork, where you kind of like it. I mean, you go back. Yeah. Okay. Maybe not the original, but it just, something that's a little bit different that sometimes you can't go back. You go back and watch it now and it's not going to land nearly as much as it did the first time you see it. Right. But there are ones, and the ones that resonate are the ones that you can go back and watch every year and around Halloween time. You can pull it off the shelf, put it in the player, because I'm old school, and watch it.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we're going to be talking about a lot of those movies over the next hour or two.
Yeah.
Yep.
You could say that the history of horror films goes back almost as far as the history of cinema. I would say the first official horror film ever made would be Thomas Edison's Frankenstein, made in 1910. There wasn't much of a success for him, and therefore he didn't make too many more horror films after that. I can't think of too many other horror films from the teens in the silent era, but when you get into the 20s, we're definitely seeing the birth of what we would call the horror film as we know it. And that, of course, leads us to the country of Germany and the world of German Expressionism.
Right.
Which all relates back to the Germanic folktales of the day and stuff. If any country is going to start doing nightmares, and, Germany is the great. Yeah.
It's no surprise that, Germany cornered the market in the 20s.
For sure. I'm a huge fan of those films. I don't know if you've seen too many of them.
I've seen a lot of Murnau films and
Nosferatu.
Yeah, Nosferatu, of course, comes to mind, and a few others like Faust. The way these things were shot at the Cabinet of Caligari, these German Expressionist films at the time, I mean, they put just enough kind of makeup and prosthetic on characters' faces to make them look. I mean, you can see it's makeup and they're not quite a normal human, but they're not monstrous. So that just enough to make them look different enough to be creepy and scary. And yeah, it's those dark angles and
all the
corners,
askew lighting, and
nothing's quite a square angle, and like the buildings are shaped weird and the sets are constructed odd, and it's just a great cinematic genre in and of itself, the German Expressionism, and specifically the horror and element of German Expressionism.
Guys like Paul Lenny, who I'm a big fan of, who did The Man Who Laughs,
right,
with Conrad Veidt. For a lot of people, it's the original inspiration of the Joker character.
Yeah. Do you have that? I've never seen that. I've seen enough footage that I'm super interested.
Yeah, it's great. He also did one I know I lent you, The Cat and the Canary.
Yeah.
It's one of the first haunted house.
That's a good flick.
That's a good one. You could say the very first, The Silent Phantom of the Opera, could be considered a horror film.
Oh, absolutely. Lon
Chaney
was an absolute genius. And
I guess Lon Chaney would be the American star if you're talking about horror films in America.
Yeah.
He'd be your guy.
Definitely. And sadly for most audiences, most of his movies exist in the silent era, if not all of them, and too many people aren't interested in that. But I don't think Phantom of the Opera in any format has been better than the Lon Chaney version.
Yeah, it's so great.
Yeah,
it still looks great today.
I mean, that ghoulish face of his on the staircase looking up at the audience members and the crowds is a great moment in cinema history.
I love the old silent movies. They're just so unique, and they're not boring. You pay more attention, I think, to silent movies than you do to sound movies. movies. You just kind of have to.
They're good at capturing the mood because you're right. They have to earn your focus. They have to earn your attention. Like you see images of some of these older movies now and they stand the test of time, and sure, the footage might be grainy, but that's kind of one of the cool things about it too. And, maybe adds that little extra bit of charm to it.
For sure. There's a few silent movies I'm dying to lend you.
Do it.
We can't talk about Lon Chaney without referring to him by the nickname that so many people at the time knew him as being the man of the thousand faces. Mm-hmm. He would do all his own makeup, and he created the look of all those different characters he played. And
more than just faces. Even in something like The Penalty, I don't know if you've heard of that one, where he has his legs bound up. He's playing a paraplegic.
Okay, right. I think I remember that.
He did the whole performance with his legs bound up on these kind of...
Never saw it, but I read about it. Yeah.
Yes, he went all out in his performances, for sure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. One of the best of his era.
Mm-hmm. Oh, another one made by the same guy who did Caligari. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called The Hands of Orlac. You'll know the premise for sure. It's one of those early ones where a man loses his hands and he gets new hands reattached to the hands of a murderer.
As soon as that happens, you're in trouble.
Right, exactly. That one's really effective. And then one, I guess it could be considered a horror film. It's almost like a horror documentary. It came out in 1922 from a Danish director named Benjamin Christensen. It's called Hexan. It's spelled Haxan. Have you ever seen that?
I've seen that, yeah.
It's kind of crazy.
It's good. It's about the history of witchcraft throughout the world. And for sure, there's a lot of embellishment and a lot of factual errors in it, but it's fascinating nonetheless. And one of the best documentaries I've ever seen, really.
Nothing like it that I can think of in cinema. It's kind of a one of a kind.
Yeah, really. We'd be remiss, or I'd be remiss to say that, not mention that Hitchcock, of course, did a lot of work during the era of German Expressionism. He worked at the studios there and got a lot of training there. And that's his first film he directed. He directed for one of those studios and before moving back to England to continue his directorial career. But he did a lot of art direction work and so on and learned from the German Expressionists. And you can see definitely that influence on his career.
Are you a big fan of The Lodger?
Yeah, I love The Lodger.
Yeah. Would you consider that a horror film? It has all the elements that you might need.
I think I would call it. As far as 1920s goes, I'd call it a horror film. Certainly incredibly suspenseful.
Like you were leading to before with the German Expressionism, didn't last very long. And most of the filmmakers in that era, whether it was Murnau or Paul Lenny or someone like Fritz Lang, all immigrated to America when Hitler came in. So all those great guys who were making these atmospheric movies all shipped down to Hollywood. I don't know how many of them ended up in Universal, but I guess you could say the next wave of horror films after the German silent films would definitely be the 1930s Universal movies.
Yeah, for sure.
With directors like James Whale, who did Frankenstein.
Todd Browning,
of course, who did Dracula and Freaks. That's another pretty crazy movie.
Absolute classic. And that's
Gooble Gobble.
Google Gobble, yeah. I just watched Wolf of Wall Street again recently.
Right.
You couldn't make a movie like Freaks today. Just not in the same way. Forget it.
Yeah, another one-of-a-kind movie. And you're a fan of the classic Universal ones, Dracula, Frankenstein.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Universal films. There was probably like 4 or 5, maybe even 6 different series that all kind of coalesced more or less into one franchise when they did those mashups, like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and the House of Dracula, and House of Frankenstein.
Yeah. They started losing their legs a little bit by
those ones are a lot of fun, just to have all those monsters packed into them, but they're not.
They don't have nearly the same atmosphere that the early ones did
compared to the Dracula franchise. I'd say I probably like Dracula's daughter more than the original Dracula.
And you're a bigger fan of the Spanish version of Dracula too,
I'd say the Spanish version of Dracula, which I don't know if we've talked about that before in the podcast, shot at the same time as Todd Browning's Dracula with the same script, same sets, but with Spanish actors. So instead of dubbing Bela Lugosi and so on into Spanish, they shot it with Spanish actors for the Mexican market. And yeah, that's a better film. That's a better version of Dracula than the Todd Browning one. And
I don't know if I'd say better, but it's definitely worth watching for sure. I put them on probably about the same.
Yeah, I mean, Todd Browning's Dracula is out of the classic Universal horrors, The Mummy, Wolfman, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man. It's probably the worst of the 5, in my opinion. And
I like it more than The Wolfman, I think.
Do you?
Yeah.
I really like The Wolfman.
Yeah. And your favorite being? Mine's Frankenstein.
Frankenstein is...
For Boris Karloff's
Yeah, Frankenstein is very good. Yeah, I'd have to agree with you on that. Frankenstein, probably Bride of Frankenstein after that. And then I think I like The Wolfman quite a bit.
I love Claude Rains, but you don't see him in The Invisible Man.
Yeah, exactly. Claude Rains also shows up in The Wolfman.
Mm-hmm. There, besides the Universal horror ones, there was a few other ones that I enjoyed. I guess one movie I should talk about that I love, thinking of a very famous actor associated with horror films, would be Peter Lorre.
Mm-hmm.
We should talk about M.
M, yeah.
If you consider M a horror film,
I'm sure
it's
some
one
would.
of my favorites, yeah.
Yeah.
It's more of a crime film, I guess, but it's dealing with a child killer, so it's pretty
exactly, yeah. And it's, rooted firmly in Fritz Lang's German Expressionist phase. M is a masterpiece. It's a great film, and Peter Lorre is wonderful with it. And that kangaroo court scene at the end, fantastic. Yeah, I love M quite a bit.
Yeah.
And Peter Lorre, one of the absolute best. A voice and face that is unforgettable.
You got it. Paul, Ivan, have you guys seen any of the Universal horror movies?
Yeah, some of them. I think I've seen them on like late night TV, but not enough to like remember them that well. But
they're a product of its time for sure.
Oh, of course. There's some classic scenes that they always have in those movies that people still do today, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you even look at little kids dressing up as vampires that are very much modeled after the Bela Lugosi's, right?
Yeah, like, Karloff, Frankenstein, yeah.
Exactly. Like those are the standard even to this day.
Yeah, they're still the iconic.
Yeah, the look.
Yeah, actors of those characters.
Well, and done right, that story can really gravitate and land with you. Like one of the first scary things I ever watched when I was a kid was this Dracula movie. And I was so young, I couldn't tell you which version it was, but it was just on TV and around Halloween. And our babysitter let my sister and I watch it. And I had to sleep in my parents' room for the next 2 nights because I wanted to see this and it scared the shit out of me. So,
and you never saw that babysitter again.
Probably not.
Wow.
But yeah, just done right. Seeing it in the right moment. This legendary character, doesn't matter if it's updated. The core of the story is the same. And
and it doesn't matter that you were a kid and the movie was probably 60 years older than you were.
Exactly. You're still getting, pardon the pun, sucked in.
If it was black and white, it would have been probably the one from 1931.
Yeah, and it very well might have been. Like I said, it was so long ago, I don't really remember, but it's had a lasting impact on me to the point where I remember today the effect it had on me.
Excellent. Okay, so moving out of America, like you were saying, once they started the mashup of all of these, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman meets Dracula meets everybody, those movies had kind of lost their punch a little bit. For me, the next great wave of horror films comes in the 40s from producer Val Lewton.
Absolutely.
Yeah, his films are terrific.
And I'd say those films, with the possible exception of Frankenstein and maybe even Bride of Frankenstein, those ones transcend the more famous Universal horror films.
Wow. So we're talking about Cat People. Curse of the Cat People. Leopard Man.
Bedlam.
I Walked with the Zombie.
I Walked with the Zombie. Isle of the Dead. And the masterpiece of them, The Seventh Victim.
Oh, you love that one too?
Oh, I love The Seventh Victim.
I love it.
That's great.
I love that one.
Yeah.
And probably my favorite out of all of Val Lewton's. I don't know why.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with you too.
Certain creepiness to that. I just watched it again
last
year.
Yeah, I just watched it. I just watched it when our son Cooper was born a few weeks ago. We didn't have a lot of time at night to watch movies and TV, and I had a few DVDs of Val Lewton's that I hadn't watched yet. I'd seen these movies before, but so I caught up with a few things like The Seventh Victim and Ghost Ship. Ghost Ship being one that was, for fear of being copyright prosecution, it wasn't released for decades. But anyways, yeah, Seventh Victim, watched it again recently. These were easy movies to watch along with episodes of the last season of Community.
Right.
That in the barely hour of TV watching we could get in a night with a newborn in the house, that we caught up on these. And I think Megan was a little disturbed by the Seventh Victim. It's not a fun film.
No, but for something made in the early 40s to still pack a punch, it's great. Kind of reminds me of Rosemary's Baby for some reason.
Absolutely, yeah. And these films were made on a shoestring budget. They'd have like 17, 18-day shooting schedules, and they're often, Val Lewton is credited with the first shock scare, speaking of shock scare, from the bus bursting into the frame in Cat People.
You know what makes that scene so great? It's the air brakes on the bus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the Leopard Man has a very famous moment when the girl's at the door trying to get in.
The death at the very beginning of the film. Yeah, it's tough to watch.
Yeah, these films have lots of great stuff.
I Walked with a Zombie. That whole walk through and that was all. Just think that was shot on a set.
Yeah, but the cinematography in that, directed by Jacques Tourneur, absolutely is creepy as hell.
Yeah, Jacques
One of the great movies about a cult and zombies for sure.
For sure, yeah. And
such a silly title, but it's
zombie
it really works.
in the Caribbean voodoo sense, not the
exactly,
George Romero sense. Dead. Yeah, and just one of the scenes of pure cinema, that walk through the corn or through the wheat or whatever, the sugarcane. Who knows? But great scene. And you mentioned Jacques Tourneur, who's certainly amongst the people who got his training working with Val Lewton, but Robert Wise, of course, as well.
And Mark Robson's the other guy we should mention. He's
Right. Those three would be the biggest collaborators with Val Lewton at the time. And did we mention The Body Snatcher, which starred both another Val Lewton produced movie directed by Robert Wise, starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. And what a good movie that is, too.
That is. I haven't seen that one in years. Yeah, these are great old movies.
Cinephiles know the Val Lewton movies, but for some reason, the general audience movies don't know them because they don't have the famous names like Wolfman and Dracula and Frankenstein. But check out these Val Lewton horror films. Absolutely, you're doing yourself a favor.
For sure. Unfortunately, as great as they were, though, we're talking about a short run. I think all of these movies we just talked about came out within about 6 years.
Yeah, I think there's about 9 of them or so, and then...
and that was it.
That was it. Then Val Lewton tried to make a few more dramatic films after that. They didn't quite hit home. And
him and Mark Robson made one that I finally caught up with because I'm such a completionist, so I wanted to see everything they've done.
Yeah.
It was a movie called Youth Runs Wild.
Yeah, I'm interested in that one for the teen B-movie aspect.
It's really bad. Really bad.
Really?
Yeah, I'd stay away from that and pretend their names aren't on it. After Val Lewton, though, I would say the next phase of horror films in the 50s and probably even into the 60s came from Hammer Studios. What they tried to do was capitalize on everything Universal did in the 30s and kind of amp up the stakes a little bit. They took all of these classic Frankenstein, Dracula, all of these monsters and redid them in color, added blood.
Color,
a little bit of sex,
more blood, sexuality, widescreen photography, and
and Christopher Lee.
Exactly. Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. So they were pretty great.
Yeah, you're
maybe not great, but
right.
There's a lot to like there.
Right. I can't think of one that I think is fantastic, but they're all pretty good.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun watching them for sure. I mean, like you say, Christopher Lee as Count Dracula, obviously the inspiration for Count Dooku in Star Wars, and Peter Cushing would always play Van Helsing. I mean, these guys, magnificent actors, and man, their strength as actors is what sold the effectiveness of these films. Really,
right? Exactly.
They'd probably come across as corny B movies without those guys in them.
Sure, they gave them a certain bit of class.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I do enjoy those quite a bit. Most of them directed by Terrence Fisher. Seems to have his name on.
Oh, really? Okay.
A lot of them. And then after Hammer Studios, I would say we're getting to the 60s now, and I would like to talk about 2 months in 1960. 2 films were released within just 2 months of each other. I'll talk about the second one first, which is, of course, one of the most seminal horror films of all time, Psycho, which debuted June 16th, 1960.
Considered the first modern horror film.
Right. Really turned the tables on what audiences might have been expecting.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any guess what my other film might be? Which debuted just 8 weeks earlier, April 7th, 1960.
I'm hoping it's a William Castle movie, but no. Okay.
Just as controversial, unfortunately not acclaimed like Psycho, and actually killed the career of this director. And this would be Peeping Tom, directed by Michael Powell.
Right. Yeah.
This is about a photographer in London who kills his victims with his tripod.
Yeah.
It's almost like a phallic type representation. This movie has a lot of shades of Psycho in it. Mm-hmm. It's dealing with a very sick, twisted individual. It amped the violence and stakes up, but this was rejected and repelled in Britain and killed the career of the great Michael Powell.
Yeah, he made several magnificent films.
Him and Pressburger, right.
Powell and Pressburger, yeah.
Unbelievable. So it's really strange that these movies came out within such a limited time between each other and had such absolutely different results.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain it?
It's tough. And like a lot of it, I think we need to look at it in the context of history too, because I mean, Hitchcock continues to be revered today as one of the greatest directors ever. And for cinema goers, cinephiles too, so is Michael Powell.
For Martin Scorsese, Michael Powell's his favorite director.
Right, extremely respected filmmaker who made some great movies. Why did one's career get killed at that moment, the others didn't? I don't know. I mean, Hitchcock, people forget that he did face a lot of controversy because of Psycho, and there were elements that thought it was too violent and too bloody and too dark. And he had a brilliant idea for a movie soon after Psycho, in which the hero would be played by James Stewart. And speaking of the guy whose hands are replaced, so the plot of this film would involve a man who got a blind man who got eye surgery, and he has now new eyes, naturally the eyes of a killer. And on a trip to Disneyland with his family, he would start to see the killings and so on that the perpetrator who he got his eyes from had committed. After Psycho, Disney, the Walt Disney Company, wanted nothing to do with Hitchcock and did not want this man in any way, shape, or form to be shooting a movie in Disneyland. Like, what a great idea for a movie this would have been, but didn't kill his career, but certainly faced some problems because of the violence in Psycho.
Is there a script of that?
I don't know
Like,
how
how
far
far
it was
along?
developed. I don't know how far. I don't know if there's a full script. I think, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm making this up, but I think Ernest Lehman was going to be writing it.
Wow. Well,
It sounds
got better than that.
one of the best unmade movies ever, for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's funny because Hitchcock always had lots of ideas. So I don't know how complete. He might have just had kind of a rough sketch of an idea for a movie. He always talked about his famous murder scene that he never got a chance to shoot.
Yeah.
That
No, I don't remember, actually.
It's had to
Surprisingly
do
enough.
with an auto factory, and he always wanted to show the completion of a car, you know,
Right.
from scratch, from the frame being built and the doors and the tires and everything
Yeah.
to it being brand new, being right off the
Comes
lot.
off the assembly
Comes
line
off
at the
lot,
end.
They open the door and there's a dead body.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then,
He could never figure out how to get there,
no, I mean,
but he always wanted to do that.
it's a brilliant idea, but
It
yeah,
is.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Come up with a way to work that into the film, though.
That's funny. I never heard about that Disneyland one, though.
Yeah, that would have been a wonderful movie,
That's
hopefully.
brilliant. Well, I guess there wasn't any other theme parks to go to maybe at the time, but
But yeah, not as well known or
Yeah.
to give that iconic imagery
Right,
that Disneyland would give you.
right, of such a happy family environment seeing all these
Being torn
horrible
apart by
things.
mayhem and murder.
Oh, I want to see that now.
I wonder why Disney wasn't on board.
Right. So yeah, Paul, what are your thoughts on Psycho?
It's a movie that I really honestly think I need to revisit because I saw it at such a young age that it was the age where I was into the Friday the 13th and Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street. So it was maybe a little too well made for me to appreciate at the time.
Right.
So I think I viewed it at a time where I couldn't appreciate the nuances and couldn't appreciate the filmmaking that went into it, where I believe I could watch it now and have a much bigger appreciation of it now. So,
It gets
I mean,
better every time, yeah.
obviously I'm aware of it. I'm aware of the story and everything like that. So yeah, it's one that I feel like I really need to revisit.
If you like that, I definitely recommend the show, Bates Motel.
Yeah, that's come up on the podcast a few times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I
if
should
you like
get on
Psycho, definitely give that
Yeah.
show a shot.
Yeah, and you're a fan of Psycho too, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. It's one of those where, once again, they keep so much hidden from you, and there's not even any gore in it. You just maybe see some blood,
Mhm.
but it was just so well done.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the end, like, the ending actually caught me off guard. Like, you don't see that coming. These days, you see a horror movie, you know who the villain is from the very beginning, and you know where it's going.
Is he the villain? That's the thing. Anthony Perkins gives such a great performance in it. At the beginning, he's definitely, I guess, the bad guy, you would think. But there's that great moment when he's dumping her body in the
Pond or whatever.
Yeah, and the car's submerging, and it stops, and he gets worried a second, then it starts submerging again and goes under the water. And I think at that moment is the moment you switch, and you're on Norman's side for the rest of the movie. Well, of course, you have no one else, I guess, to cheer for because she's dead.
Yeah, it's not like she was a decent person. She stole some dude's money, right?
She didn't deserve what happened to her.
No, she didn't.
But
But
she
then,
had repented right before that.
Yeah.
She was going to do the right thing. So,
when you learn that later on, it's because he's crazy.
well, we all go a little mad sometimes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
All you need is one bad day, right?
That's right. Dex. Back to Peeping Tom. I'm a fan of that movie. I don't love it nearly as much as Psycho.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, but I don't
Right.
love it.
It is rather disturbing. I think it's
Very, yeah.
more disturbing than Psycho, I think, because Anthony Perkins gives you something to hang on to with that character.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the guy in Peeping Tom is really emotionless. He's not giving the audience anything to cheer for in his character, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But a fascinating film, and I do recommend it. But I really think that summer of 1960, like we said, up the stakes on what directors. Everyone was going to have to try to top the next Psycho.
Exactly, yeah. And because of Psycho, we got some of the movies we did
for sure
throughout the 60s and 70s.
Right. You mentioned the name William Castle before.
Yeah.
We should probably talk about a few of his movies.
He's been referred to as a poor man's Hitchcock to put him in context.
Right. Yeah, exactly. More of a showman than a director, that's for sure.
Yeah.
He was the guy who came up with Smell-O-Vision.
Oh, yeah. Did all the gimmicks.
He was total gimmick guy. And for the movie The Tingler, had the electrodes in everybody's seat.
Exactly,
to make them jump.
You'd have the person run screaming into the theater or screaming out of the theater, whatever it was, and
wearing a monster outfit.
Yeah, exactly. Or he'd pay someone to sit in the audience and faint.
Right.
And then the actresses dressed as nurses would come in and take them out.
Would have kids like sign release forms before they'd come into the theater in case they'd have heart attacks. And,
just to drum up publicity and everything.
Absolutely.
Like you said, a showman. Very much a showman.
Right. He did movies like The House on Haunted Hill and 13 Frightened Girls. That Joan Crawford movie, Straight Jacket.
Right. Straight Jacket was fun.
Right. And speaking of trying to up the ante on Psycho, he did one probably my favorite one of his is one I lent you recently called Homicidal.
Yeah. And there's some interesting things in there. There's some dealing with interesting filmmaking techniques he uses to portray the characters and crimes that he wants to. And those are fun movies to watch, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. They don't take themselves too seriously.
No, exactly, yeah.
And there's a movie that's, it's not a biopic or anything, but it's definitely about him. It's called Matinee with John Goodman. Came out in the mid-90s, and it's all about this kind of showman who's running a movie theater and trying to scare kids right during the weekend of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, wow.
Sounds familiar for
Yeah,
some reason.
yeah, it's directed by Joe Dante, who did Gremlins and a few others, so I recommend that.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. Someone else we should be talking about, besides William Castle, talk about showman, more on the production side, would be Roger Corman. He was famous for all of these gothic operas that he put on in the 60s, where there was a lot of Edgar Allan Poe.
Right, things like The Raven,
Mask of the Red Death, Fall of the House of Usher.
Right, yeah.
All to minimal effect.
Yeah.
Like the William Castle films. They're all worth a watch.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Not terrific.
And a lot of them had, like the Hammer films had strong actors. They'd have someone like Vincent Price in them, would deliver maybe a little more over-top performance because he knew what he was doing there and he knew why he was hired. But still a performance that would root the film with enough credibility that make them, even today, very much watchable.
For the most part, only shot in 10 days.
Yeah, great Technicolor sets and costume design, and just everything looked wonderful. And they were less bloody than the Hammer films, for sure, but very atmospheric films.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fun to them and good scores in a lot of them too.
The Pit and the Pendulum is a good one. Witchfinder General has a great performance by Vincent Price.
I don't think I saw either of those two, actually.
Yeah, they're both worth the look. Roger Corman, again, we could do a whole show just on him. He's
been in the business for decades as a director and producer, and almost always firmly in the B-movie realm, and he helped launch the careers of many filmmakers, gave many people their first shot.
Absolutely. Outside of the gothic operas that Roger Corman made, there's two that I really want to recommend. One is called Bucket of Blood. Came out in 1959. It has
what a great title.
It is great. This actor named Dick Miller. You know him, I'm sure, from 100 performances. He's a minor character actor, but he's the lead in this one, and he's terrific in it. And it's kind of a macabre comedy dealing with the beatnik generation, and he's kind of wiping them out. And another one that I really enjoy is called The Man with X-Ray Eyes.
Nice. Oh, that sounds familiar.
It's a terrific, kind of low budget. Like Roger Corman shot all of these on a shoestring budget.
Yeah.
Some of them are actually pretty decent. And he always hired really good actors, which helped. Gave the films a certain pedigree that they might not have had, and he took them more seriously. But The Man with X-Ray Eyes is good. Dex, did you want to talk about anything in particular? I know you're a big fan of The Haunting.
I am. Robert Wise's The Haunting, which, well, do I need to beat it to death? The sense of atmosphere in that film. All of the scares are achieved with sounds. You hear some terrifying sounds, and it is a scary film. And I think there's one special effect in the film of a door that seems to breathe, that seems to push inwards, that door. Aside from that, there's no special effects, and it's absolutely terrifying. And I remember when the remake came out from The Haunting, and the trailer was filled with CGI of, statues turning to look at the characters as they pass them throughout the house. And Robert Wise's The Haunting achieves that same idea by tricking you. There's mirrors and there's characters turning around and camera angles, but there's no special effects. There's no statues really turning around and looking at them. There's just people spotting something in the mirror or through the glass or the other side of the room. And it's shot with such skill that it works.
And you mentioned the sound before, too. I think that probably comes from his days as an editor.
Yeah.
Right, before he became a director.
Undoubtedly.
Really that. And it's such a familiar trope, The Haunting. I don't know how many different variations of sticking a group of people inside of a scary house, to see if they last the weekend kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's been done a lot.
Right.
From 13 Ghosts, The House on Haunted Hill, The Cat and the Canary. The Legend of Hell House does
The Legend of Hell House,
That's the other one.
Yeah. Which is good, but not as good as The Haunting by a long shot.
Yeah, it's been used quite a bit.
Yeah.
But, that one is the best. Yeah, I love it. Do you guys have any thoughts on Rosemary's Baby?
I've seen it. Went really well with the whole character, how they showed everything going around her and just kind of her descent into madness. I thought it was really well done.
Like Psycho, I think it's one of the first modern horror movies. Basically, the story, Mia Farrow is a newlywed. John Cassavetes is her husband. He's kind of a struggling actor in New York. She gets pregnant, and there's a very troubling pregnancy. There's a bunch of weird people who are living in her building, and the more that Rosemary begins to understand the complications of a pregnancy, the more that she begins begins to realize that her baby is being groomed for some sort of ritual sacrifice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, again, it's kind of a slow build of a movie, but for those who want to put your time in, it's a fantastic film. Polanski has just such a control over mood and atmosphere in the film. It's one of those movies that really gets under your skin. I love it. Dex, did you want to talk about anything in particular?
Yeah, I just want to throw out a few others from over the years, but I wanted to mention also The Innocents with Deborah Kerr as a movie from the 60s, a ghost story that I'm a big fan of. Sort of horror, sort of suspense.
Did you find similarities between that and Nicole Kidman's The Others?
Yeah, I'd say so, yeah. And that's another one. Yeah, some of my more favorite horror films of the 90s would be things like The Others that had something clever in them and weren't necessarily built around horror and mayhem, but scares and suspense and that sense of dread and atmosphere. Another one I wanted to mention was the French film Les Diaboliques. Fantastic film. One of the great.
Directed by Henri Georges Clouzot.
Oh, I called it from the 60s. I'm wrong. It's
54.
From 1956.
56.
Damn. And from director Clouzot. And like we've said, audiences are sophisticated these days. They've seen these things. But this is probably one of the earliest times that twist has been used in a film. And it kind of maybe created the twist genre of the horror suspense film.
The bathtub scene?
Yeah. It's great. It's a wonderful film. And
Clouzot always said that was kind of his answer to Hitchcock films. He's like, I can make a film just as suspenseful as Hitchcock can. And supposedly Hitchcock watched it, loved it so much that he said Psycho was his answer to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
and while we're mentioning foreign films, another one I'm a big fan of is a French film from Georges Franju. It's called Eyes Without a Face. It's about a creepy, sadistic doctor who's trying to perform some experiments to help and aid his deformed daughter. That's about as much as I want to say.
Yeah.
But like Diabolique, fantastic. Yeah, those are two good choices. Eyes Without a Face and Le Diabolique.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Highly recommend those.
I know you've said we've seen movies like this hundreds of times, but I really do think going back to the original films holds up.
Exactly, it does. I mean, a modern audience member, a cynical young person might laugh at these films, think, because they can predict the ending and see where it's coming from. But watch them in the context. These are the originals. These are the films that created those iconic moments, and they're masterpieces because of that. And just because you're smart enough to see it coming doesn't mean you're smarter than the movie.
Exactly. Okay, that brings us to the American horror movies of the 70s. Let's talk about a few favorites of mine. In 1970, I wouldn't even call it a slasher film, but really for me, one of the great horror movies of all time, and talk about a movie that gets under your skin, is Wes Craven's Last House on the Left.
I've never seen it.
It's a tough watch.
I know some people love it and some people hate it.
You could I could see a lot of people turning this off. It's repugnant.
And Ebert loved this movie, didn't he?
You can be pretty squeamish. Yeah, it was
maybe not love, but he gave us big recommendations.
It absolutely works. It is completely effective in what it wants to do. It's actually a remake of an Ingmar Bergman film.
Of all people.
Of The Virgin Spring. It's about a young girl who's raped and murdered, and the perpetrators find solace in the home of the girl's parents. And the parents have no idea what's happened to their daughter, and they're taking these people in, and
Wow, I had no idea there was that connection.
Yeah, and they take a killer in and
I've not seen that
treat him. So just that basic premise is already kind of very uncomfortable. And this movie takes it all the way. If you're only familiar with Wes Craven from Scream, those movies, and maybe even Nightmare on Elm Street, he has a goofiness to those movies. This has none of that. You thought like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer?
Yeah.
It's more extreme than that, but along the same lines. A tough film to watch, but
I've always been interested, but I just don't know how I'm going to react to it.
I wouldn't watch it with Megan, I don't think. So that's a favorite of mine, and I guess some other seminal films from the 70s might be Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, certainly. Which, of course, based on the same real life killer that Psycho is based on, Ed Gein.
Yeah, he had a lot of material. I think Silence of the Lambs as well. I think
also based on Ed Gein. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Right, it's quite the claim to fame.
Yeah, look what you've done, Ed Gein. Look what you've done.
Another landmark horror film, of course, in the 70s is Carrie.
Right, yeah.
Brian De Palma.
Landmark for a few reasons. Brian De Palma's, not his debut picture, but his kind of debut studio picture.
Again, we're talking genres, but would you say Carrie is his only real horror film? No, I guess he's got a few more, like Raising Cain later and stuff. But.
Yeah. I mean, he's, of course, very Hitchcockian and very suspense-driven as a filmmaker, but out of all of De Palma's films, Carrie would be the one that if you were going to name it as a horror film, it's that one. And, of course, based on the first novel written by Stephen King. Right. So, I mean, that's pretty significant in and of itself. And I mean, you watch Carrie and you see that this is a director who's got a lot of style and a lot of capability with the camera, and there's some wonderful filmmaking there. And as far as, if you want to call it revenge horror goes, it might be the benchmark.
Oh, yeah. That's a great last 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And one of the first real big jump scares in movie history, if you remember Amy Irving at the grave.
Yeah, I don't remember, but right, yeah, okay, yeah.
That was a big jump scare at the time.
Yeah.
For movie audiences.
I thought Carrie was a really good movie, and I think it really works. Just the fact, not just on top that it's a supernatural when she has powers, but it's the whole playing on teenagers' minds of just the way that they're tortured in high school, how everybody feels like an outcast. How sometimes you want to just kind of go mental at everybody that just teases the shit out of you, right?
Totally, to the extreme.
Yeah.
Oh, and here we go. Possibly one of my favorite horror films of all time, and also from the early 70s, is, of course, The Exorcist.
Right.
I know you're an atheist, as am I, but when I saw The Exorcist for the first time, I wasn't. And I think that does hold the more you believe in what's going on in that movie, the more it affects you, that's for sure.
And it's allegedly based on a real case, and I'm sure extremely embellishes what happened in the real incident, but it almost works as a docudrama in the sense of this is what, or possibly what, a priest performing an exorcist might go through.
But even that first half of the movie, it's more just an investigation into the daughter's illness.
Exactly, and that's
so out of the horror realm.
Think of going through something like that and just not knowing like what the hell is wrong with my daughter. And
right. Yeah, right. It takes such a documentary approach to it.
You don't think.
By the time you get to the end, it does seem so real.
Yeah, for sure.
And also maybe we haven't talked about performances a lot in horror movies. They're not famous for it, but you have Ellen Burstyn and Max von Sydow and Jason Miller does a great job in that movie too. But when you have someone like Ellen Burstyn holding it all together, it just elevates all of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Paul, what are your thoughts on The Exorcist? I assume you've seen that one.
I saw this one, actually. I saw the re-release in the theater, and it's one of those things where, unfortunately, you catch up to it after all the hype, and you build up a movie in your mind, and I watched it, and because I had seen so many, slasher horror movies up to this point, I think this is another one kind of on the level of Psycho, where I have to go revisit it, where I can actually appreciate it as a film, rather than going into it with the expectation of the scariest movie ever, and watching it going, it's okay. I know Darren's shooting me glares right now, but there's the one shot that I actually quite like where they show the Exorcist, and there's, at least in my mind, I can see the steamer, the fog behind them, and just a silhouette. And that's the kind of stuff that I really like, that atmosphere.
Yeah, him arriving?
Yeah.
That iconic
shot. They use it on the poster,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's terrific.
Yeah.
Another film from the mid-70s I'm a big fan of is The Wicker Man.
Yeah, and you know what? We just watched that. I haven't seen that in maybe 10 years or more, and I popped it in for Megan the other night, and I warned her. I said, it's not a scary movie. Like, she absolutely didn't want to watch it because she thought it would disturb her. She's actually, Megan, who is as atheistic as we are, she just, over the last few years, for some reason, certain scary movies have got under her skin, and she's like, I don't want to watch The Wicker Man.
Just because you don't believe in God doesn't mean that you can't be afraid of people who do believe in God.
That's a very good point. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But she was...
Especially these people.
Yeah, she was very, unwilling to go through with watching this at first. And I didn't tell her what it was about, really. I just said, it's not scary. It's more kind of atmospheric, and maybe I didn't sell it in the right way. And I don't know if she enjoyed it as much as I would have liked. I don't think she was prepared for how quirky it was and almost silly, like the villagers on this island.
Right. They come across the exact opposite of threatening.
Not threatening, but people that you don't trust for sure. Right. And I don't know if I'd classify it as horror either. I don't know what other genre you could put The Wicker Man in, the original from the 70s. It's a weird, quirky, independent film that maybe is kind of a horror film, but it's got some disturbing things in there for sure.
Yeah, I would say the last 20 minutes gives it the status of horror film for me.
Yeah, definitely.
And a good lead performance, too.
Oh, yeah, he's very good. And, surprising faces popping in there like Britt Eklund and...
Oh, yeah. Faces and other sides.
And other parts of it. And Christopher Lee. And, that whole innkeeper's daughter sequence is just brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I love it. It's rightly hailed as a cult film.
Great cult film,
Yeah, for sure. Another one that still works for me is The Omen.
I love The Omen.
Maybe it didn't scare me like The Exorcist. It's almost kind of weird to say it's more fun than The Exorcist. But,
there's nothing fun about The Exorcist.
Yeah, I love the investigative nature of it, too. The journalist who's trying to figure out everything with the weird photographs that he's taking and what eventually happens to him. That's a great death scene, too.
Definitely. Oscar-winning score by Jerry Goldsmith. Great, scary stuff.
Fantastic. That one still holds up. I think it's great.
I agree. I actually sought that one out on Blu-ray because I thought, no, this deserves good treatment. I want to see this in its best possible format.
But once again, that movie was also built around the psychological element. You know, there was no special effects that I could age badly, right? It was just performance-based.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
It doesn't need it. The material is so strong. Richard Donner directing and Gregory Peck. I mean, you don't need much more than that.
Like I said, if the movie creates enough of a sense of atmosphere and suspense, a very recent film from just a few years ago, The Woman in Black, had such a profound, not that I was like shaking and having nightmares for weeks or anything, but it scared me enough that I'd be a little scared looking over my shoulder in my basement at night. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that woman in black's not real and she's not over my shoulder, but I still wanted to get up those stairs pretty quickly after grabbing my can of Coke. You know what I mean? It's, the atmosphere in that movie definitely, while I was sitting there in the theater, created such a sense of dread in me that they're exploring that house and I am genuinely scared.
Nice.
Literally scared.
Yeah. And I love that. Like, just set the right tone, set the right atmosphere, like you said. And I'll live in that world.
Mm-hmm. And it's so classically told. If you're someone who enjoyed that movie, there's a good chance you're going to enjoy a lot of the movies that we're talking about. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Rely mostly on the same thing. Yeah.
And did you know The Omen had a TV show, a sequel? Where like Damien's, in his like 30s?
It had Omen 1, 2, and 3, the final chapter, which kind of told the story as a trilogy.
Yeah.
I didn't know it went anywhere beyond that.
Yeah, I did the TV show where he's like in his 30s and he's like, he repressed all those memories. They were going to go in that way, but I just didn't get very far.
Were the sequels actually worth checking out? Because I love the first one so much that I've actually been a little more hesitant to check out the other two.
The second one is more interesting. It's kind of Damien as a teenager and discovering that who he really is and accepting it. Because in the first movie, he's just a kid. He's just kind of reacting to how he feels. Mm-hmm. And then by the third movie, Sam Neill plays him. And that's when he's starts getting into politics and fulfilling his destiny, prophecy. That one's probably the weakest one for sure. It kind of loses steam as it goes along, but it should have been a great capper to the trilogy. But if you're curious, you could check them out.
You should have ended with Damien in the White House or whatever.
They're not terrible, but not as good as the first one.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then, of course, I think 1978, John Carpenter's Halloween came out, which would probably be the preeminent slasher film.
I think so. And definitely the Kickstarter of what would be the 80s horror film.
And so much more classically done than all the stuff in the 80s, in my opinion.
Oh, for sure. Even the first one or two Friday the 13th movies are trash compared to John Carpenter's Halloween.
Right. All they did was add more gore. And violence. But Halloween doesn't really have a lot of that. It's really talk about dealing with suspense.
Yeah, for sure.
It's been a little while since I've seen the very first one, but I remember watching the very first one and thinking, that still really holds up. And that's from 78?
Yeah, the original Halloween is 78.
Yeah.
And the score to it.
Classic.
It all works really well. And Michael Myers is one of the great baddies of movie history.
I've often said guys like Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger must have watched Halloween and seen the scene where Mike Myers puts the bedsheet over his head with the victim's glasses on top and just thought, genius, absolute genius. If only I had thought of that. I absolutely love that shot.
It works so well.
It does, yeah.
It's great.
Very good movie.
As you say, it was a great start. For me, the 80s slasher films really took a nosedive with the Friday the 13th movies and Prom Night. I guess Nightmare on Elm Street at least has some ingenuity to it.
Yeah.
Growing up, it seemed like there was one of these every week. You'd go to the video store and it would just be hundreds of these slasher titles that you could never really possibly keep up with. I don't know how many of them you guys saw over the years.
Ooh, Pumpkinhead. Oh, I haven't seen this.
Not just Pumpkinhead, like Children of the Corn. They had
Children of the
Slumber
Corn.
Party Massacre, Sorority Party Massacre, a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. And Stephen King, as great a writer as he is, not a lot of terrific movies in the 80s. After Carrie and The Shining, his movies really took a nosedive.
I still like Pet Sematary, and it might be a little bit of a guilty pleasure, but that's a movie that
Does it hold out? I haven't seen that one since the theater.
I haven't seen it in about 5 years since I got it on DVD, and maybe some of the makeup effects don't necessarily work, but it's still certain elements of that movie that just kind of hit me like towards the end when the kid sits up off the table after he's been hit by the semi, and just certain things like that still gravitate. Maybe you find it a little more humorous now than you did the first time you saw it, but like I said, maybe that's bordering a little bit more on guilty pleasure realm. But Children of the Corn is just one of those movies that I loved when I was a kid.
I rewatched that one recently, and it is terrible.
I remember building that movie up, watching it when I was a kid and loving it, and then watching horror movies with my buddy probably about 10, 15 years ago, and he had never seen it. I'm like, oh, you gotta watch this movie. It's great. 10 minutes in, you misremembered this movie.
And again, that spawned 3 or 4 sequels, and you think the original one would be somewhat decent.
Yeah, didn't they do even a remake with Christopher Reeves?
No, that was Village of the Damned.
Ah, right.
And the original Village of the Damned, I didn't talk about that one earlier, is fantastic. Children of the Damned and Village of the Damned, two films are great.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to go to the video store and just look at the lurid cover art for some of these movies. I remember this one that disturbed me as a child. It was, couldn't tell you what the name of the movie was, but it would have all these meat hooks hanging up in a shed somewhere or something in a barn. And there was like a bloody woman's corpse hanging from one of the meat hooks, and just the painting on these.
I think I know
these cover art. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it. I loved they disturbed me as a child. The covers on these VHS boxes.
It's Alive with a little baby.
Yeah, It's Alive was scored by Bernard Herrmann of all people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, talk about adding a classy element to a not so classy film.
But even at the time, growing up in that era, these weren't my favorite movies.
No, these were not films that I was generally interested in watching and cared about. And
those are more of the famous ones.
Yeah, exactly.
I imagine, there's hundreds that we've dismissed.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a Wikipedia page somewhere that lists like 80s slasher films, and I'm sure they have some great sounding titles, but man, are they shitty movies. Yeah, the 80s horror genre, and I guess maybe the Child's Play movies would kind of be the apex and finishing off of the genre until, it died out and was reinvigorated by Scream, I suppose.
Exactly. The 90s, weren't big for slasher films and horror films in general. Did we miss any 80s movies, slasher films that you want to talk about?
Well, one of the 80s movies that I really like is The Evil Dead.
Sam Raimi, the original.
Yeah. I kind of like the whole series, even though Evil Dead 2 is kind of a remake of Evil Dead 1.
They change in tone so much.
Oh, yeah. And not just that, when you watch Evil Dead 2, it starts off so serious, but halfway through it becomes goofy and over the top. But I still really enjoy those movies.
The first one is still scary. It's legitimately terrifying.
Because it was always done with camera zooms in. It's all based on, you don't actually see what's going on. You always see the characters just reacting to what's going on.
The original great Cabin in the Woods movie. Yeah.
I think another one around that time is The Thing, right? The original.
John Carpenter's?
Yes.
Yeah. That's not the original.
Right.
Howard Hawks, 1951.
Whatever.
Okay. Just saying.
Still awesome.
Yeah, that one, I mentioned on the 80s podcast how much I love that one. It's one of my favorite horror films.
And it's one of those, you had those aspects of the slasher, right, with the people dying, but it's also of the fact that you don't know who's killing them, you don't know who it is. It's playing with your mind, because you're trying to figure out as much as the characters as who it is now, right? Because it keeps switching.
And that sense of isolation and...
Great grotesque horror and just suspense, great suspense.
I don't know if you guys know, the original story was written in the 50s. It was a short story called Who Goes There? And it was really all about communism. McCarthyism was going on at the time, the McCarthy hearings, and it was all about who's a communist and who's your friend and who's not your friend. And it was kind of an allegory on that.
You can totally see that.
Yeah.
I always watched the film with that in mind.
Yeah, preying on people's insecurity, especially in those days, because everybody was so paranoid.
I think I said it before, but that movie it conveys such a sense of dread, not taught by many other movies, in my opinion.
I agree. I was late to the party on that one. I didn't see that one until probably 7 years ago, but man, I was glad I finally got a chance to see it, and it holds up. And that's one of the things that you always watch one of these older movies, kind of like what I mentioned on the Blade Runner podcast, where you're watching an old movie, how well is it going to stand up? And the great ones do, and this one does. I haven't seen the sequel to it that came out, what was that,
sequel,
2-3 years? Yeah, I haven't seen that, so I don't know whether that's worth catching up with. But
they're borrowing so many elements from the other one. It's almost more like a homage than a prequel. It kind of works.
Does it add anything else?
Not really. It gives kind of the backstory that you probably would already figure out when they come across the Norwegians and everything. But it's worth it if you love the movie so much like I do and you want to take a look at what they came up with. But if you only have 2 hours to kill, watch the original. Whoops, not the original. I meant the 80s version. The Do you guys have any dredged up personal moments of seeing movies as kids?
Well, for me, the whole thing of watching Dracula when I was a kid on TV, right? Other than that, not a lot, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't remember any specific instances. You know, growing up in Europe, we didn't really have censors like you guys did here. So, you know, I grew up watching like Terminator and all that kind of stuff from before I even moved to Canada. And that was like, I moved here when I was 10. So.
Right. Probably, for me, my most traumatic moment as a kid was in the movie theater when my mother and my aunt took me and my brother to see the Amityville Horror in the theater. I was 10 years old.
Oh.
And right before it started, my aunt turned to me and my brother and said in her sweet Scottish voice, "Have you heard about this story, dear? I don't know if you've heard, but it's all true. It happened." Because there had been this book. You know, these people had claimed that these events had all happened. And so me and my brother were watching this movie absolutely under the seat. Like, shocked. I didn't go down to my basement for like a month. Don't do that to kids.
No.
You know what? But that's something that you do to somebody else's kids because you don't have to deal with the problems afterwards. Like the wife and I were talking, we should really put a scary as shit clown under one of our friends' kids' beds one day.
That's another one. Poltergeist. The clown under the bed. I was pretty young when I saw that one, and that one freaked me out.
Yeah, I'd agree. I remember watching that over at my cousin's house and my parents, you know, "Oh, what movie do you want to watch? Oh, okay, we'll rent this for you and your cousins." And yeah, I remember that having a pretty lasting impact on me.
Whenever I think of monsters under her bed, I can't stop thinking of Calvin and Hobbes. Are there any monsters under my bed? No. Good, because I don't want to burn any with my flamethrower. Hobbes like, "But you don't have a flamethrower." They lie, I lie.
Yeah, speaking of animation, Paul, you're such a big animation fan. There's been a lot of semi-horror animated films over the years, whether it's Nightmare Before Christmas or a recent one, Monster House, Coraline.
Yep.
These movies prey on that too.
There's a probably lesser known horror well, I don't know if you could classify it a true horror movie, but it's called Nine, and it deals with the element of humanity and whatnot, which is a very beautiful movie. I love that movie.
Starring a burlap sack.
Yep. Yeah. And just gorgeous. But yeah, I would say Coraline is still my favorite Laika movie to date. As beautiful as Kubo and the Two Strings was, it didn't have the same weight as a Coraline did. And yeah, Monster House, I love that movie. It's such an underrated movie and perfect kids horror movie that
Monsters Inc. too. Are you a fan of that?
That's true. Yeah, I can really appreciate the cleverness of a Monsters Inc. where they kind of take the tried and true tropes of monster movies, etc., and kind of turn them on their heads, right? But yeah, I love a very kind of gothic, dark animation, something that's definitely different and not for the kids. Like Nightmare Before Christmas was one that I didn't really appreciate the first time I saw it. I kind of thought, could have been a TV special, but then once I revisited it, like 2 minutes in, I was thinking like, what was I watching when I was watching this? Because this is totally my kind of movie.
Totally. I totally agree. When I saw that in the theater, I walked out and thought, well, that was pretty entertaining, but never would I thought it could be considered a Christmas classic in one time.
Yeah.
Which it kind of is.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And as horror and animation go, there's a long history of it, probably going back all the way to like something like even Fantasia, like that Night on Bald Mountain sequence, which is still really great.
Yeah.
So yeah, long history of scary animated stuff. As I was talking about with the teenage slasher audience, there's still these children's movies. They're tapping into these kind of primal fears that kids have. And maybe it's good for kids to watch these movies at a certain age and kind of deal with these things, even when you're 6.
And it resonates with you and it sticks with you, because I still remember the first time I saw that sequence as a kid. Sure, you've got The Sorcerer's Apprentice with Mickey, and that's very cute and whatever, but
for a moment, and then that gets pretty out of control.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's kind of the gateway drug, isn't it?
You got to ease them into it, right?
The Black Cauldron? That could be considered one too.
And that's a movie that I granted I haven't seen it in a long time, but I really liked it, and I couldn't believe at the time watching it and thinking Disney put out a movie that has a villain that has a skull for a head. That seems a little dark. And I mean, we can thank that movie for underperforming and kind of reinvigorating Disney and having them focus a little bit more on their animation studios.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, you've even got the short Ichabod Crane by Disney too that deals with the Headless Horseman. And I remember seeing that as a kid and being totally enraptured with it, and that probably unnerving me a little bit. We talked earlier about what kind of got you as a kid, and that one for sure.
That's a great one. Yeah. Yeah, lots of good animated movies out there to check out as well in this horror genre.
Yep. Yeah, some of those movies might be tough for some people to get because I think the best ones are the Asian ones for those, especially when they go with anime. They can be pretty in-depth and really well done. But they actually build this world, whereas the United States is just like, here it is, right?
A little more sanitized.
Yeah.
And I never mentioned this one either. So many films to talk about, but there's a crazy Japanese movie from, I think, about 77, 78 called House. And if you haven't seen it, check it out. It is bonkers wild. Not really scary, but from set design and costume design, it's just a complete one-of-a-kind movie.
It's a thrill ride.
It's totally Japanese bizarro. Yeah. As you mentioned before, some of these big franchises like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, you guys weren't big fans of those?
When I was younger.
Growing up, I was.
Did you guys go see every one of them in the theater?
No, it was more like hitting up the video store and renting them.
By the time I think Jason came to Manhattan, my friends were dragging me to the theater, and I was like, no, I don't want to go. And it was just god-awful, and I should know better.
No, it was basically these movies were reserved for sleepovers or birthday parties where watching them then and catching up with them, but never the theater.
They don't age well at all.
Yeah, what do you think? In the last 15 years, it's really been, besides the torture porn that was really popular, it's been just remake after remake of all of these older titles, from Last House on the Left to The Hills Have Eyes.
Well, it was interesting because I think we went to the new Nightmare on Elm Street because I think it was Halloween. And when it's a horror movie and it's supposed to be really scary scenes, but everybody in the theater is laughing, you know you didn't do a good job of making a horror movie. I mean, we spend more time laughing than anything just because they tried to do some of the old tropes that they tried to do to put scares into people. Like, I remember the one part where everybody laughed was the girl was like in a bathtub, you know, just kind of having like a bath relax, and all of a sudden like Freddy's hand comes under the from the water and then it's like slowly going towards her.
That's from the first movie, isn't it?
Yeah, and everybody laughed their asses off.
Oh, so we reused the same shot?
Yeah, and everybody just thought it was funny as hell.
It's too bad, because sometimes you can update a movie and it turns out well, because I really like the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Really?
I mean, it's probably been 10 years since I've seen it. And I had never seen the original, so I had nothing to compare it to. So for me, it was all new.
It's not just relying on blood and guts in every scene trying to top itself and how gory it can be?
No, it does a really good job of using tension and mood really well. And that's one thing, is I went into it thinking, okay, yeah, whatever, this is going to be your modern day slasher where, like you said, every scene is trying to one up itself. No, I thought they did a really good job of keeping the tension there.
The original Texas Chainsaw doesn't have a lot of blood in it. It's really kind of a tame film for a guy running around wielding a chainsaw.
And being called a Massacre.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Still totally effective. Yeah. One thing in the 80s that was also popular at the time was anthology films.
Yep.
Yeah.
Should we talk about some of those, like Creepshow, Cat's Eye, and Tales from the Dark Side, Twilight Zone the movie? You know, all related back to that original Tales from the Crypt series.
Yeah. Well, and that's a show that I used to love watching on late night cable, was Tales from the Crypt. I mean, Demon Knight's a guilty pleasure, but yeah, I remember Cat's Eye, and there's a scene in one of the vignettes, at least, that's Drew Barrymore, and it's got a troll, and the cat's protecting her from the troll, and whatever. I'm like, yeah, I slept with one eye open for a little bit after that. That's the one that stuck with me, but I used to watch all of those when I was a kid.
One from Cat's Eye that I particularly like was with James Woods when he's trying to quit smoking, and he goes to this company that promises to help you quit. And oh my God, are they serious when you find out what happens when you cheat? That one's great. Yeah, those were a lot of fun.
Yep.
I don't know if you guys know the work of David Cronenberg too well, Canadian director, but he's kind of, he did The Fly and Videodrome and Dead Zone. A lot of his films deal with horror on a completely different level, more about bodily horror.
Yeah,
like
mutations
mutations, problems.
I remember
which is much scarier to me than a ghost.
Yeah.
Having something crawling in my brain.
Yeah.
You know, that's much more unsettling. His films really kind of dwell in that area. Really effective.
I remember seeing The First Fly when I was a kid, and that was probably my first
the Vincent Price one from 19...
Sorry, no. The first one that I ever saw.
The one with Jeff Goldblum?
Yeah, it was the first introduction for me to Jeff Goldblum, and I agree. It was very unsettling, kind of. Yeah, like that's one thing, especially when you're a kid, that you're like, this could happen. Ghosts, whatever. It's creepy on its own level, but yeah.
Yeah, and it starts off so cool because he's almost like a superhero at first. He's got all this strength. And you're like, hey, this ain't so bad.
Yeah.
Oh, it's...
It turns bad soon.
Yeah. Here's one from the late 80s that I'm a big fan of. Again, outside the genre a bit, but it's called Angel Heart.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Killer Clowns from Outer Space.
I've seen that one.
Me too.
Yeah. It stars Mickey Rourke and Robert De Niro.
Yeah.
Mickey Rourke plays a detective who's on this investigation into a voodoo cult and a missing man, and has a lot of supernatural elements. I don't want to give away too much, but it's terrific too.
Just your description of it, just some of the elements reminds me of Serpent and the Rainbow, which is
much better than that.
Well, yeah, that's one of those movies that I love the title, and
that's another Wes Craven one, so
yeah,
it's not bad. But Bill Pullman again.
Yeah,
a lot of mediocre movies at the time. One movie that we talked about that could be considered horror or not was Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
Ivan, you're a fan of that one, I know.
I am. It was just really well done. Like, Anthony Hopkins was creepy as shit. Mm-hmm. All the characters, the main villains were all really creepy. And you don't really see Anthony Hopkins eating anybody, but when he discusses it, it's just so creepy and you're getting that sense.
Yeah, he's definitely a great horror villain inside of a movie that's not really a horror movie.
Yeah. I love that movie as well. And I remember not being so thrilled that they made Hannibal and then watching that movie thinking, this is exactly what I didn't want. I like that character a little more subdued and maybe a little more in the background rather than yeah.
But then they did that again with Red Dragon, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and Red Dragon was actually a remake. The original Red Dragon came out before Silence.
With Brian Cox and the guy from CSI,
William Peterson.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, that's a pretty good movie too. Red Dragon. It's not a terrible movie. I actually don't mind it. It's got a great cast, and definitely I would say Brett Ratner's best movie. And that's not saying much.
No.
Okay, I think we've talked enough about the movies of the 80s and the 90s. Why don't we switch centuries here and talk about some of the new horror movies of the new millennium? As horror movies go, I don't know if American movies have been that prominent. Dex, would you say that American movies have gone through any sort of renaissance?
I wouldn't want to call it Renaissance,
not
Ron,
me.
But
not if you're calling. I guess there's the whole
Scream would be the closest to Renaissance
exactly.
it would become, and then after that would have kind of become the slasher porn genre,
on the heels of kind of the torture porn.
Torture porn, that's what I meant. Yeah, not slasher porn, torture porn, and
with
things
Saw
like
and Hostel.
Exactly, those types of films that have
which I have zero interest in.
Well, I will say for some of these franchise movies, I will say I did like the first Saw movie, but only the first one because that was more very subdued, and then I really did not see that ending coming.
Which doesn't work, but
I don't care that it doesn't, but it still, I think it worked for me. It quite surprised me. I did not expect that at all.
No, you can't expect it because it's ridiculous.
Whatever. I still liked it. But I mean, afterwards, I did not like any of the other ones. But
they're kind of a guilty pleasure for my wife and I. We watch them knowing exactly what they are and whatnot. I mean, I don't have any interest in seeing the new Jigsaw movie, but that doesn't mean that I won't eventually see it. Yeah, I look at these kind of on the level of like a Resident Evil. You go into it and you're going to get exactly what you expect, kind of over the top, gothic horror action, check your brain at the door. They're certainly not my favorite movies, but
where they're trying to top the kills from all the previous movies and whatever.
Yeah, not my cup of tea. Any of that kind of stuff by Eli Roth and that's so extreme, like Hostel. Yeah, it just doesn't work for me. Yeah, because I think it's just too easy just to stick knives in people and stuff and watch people watch it. It's more like a snuff film to me than, art.
No, I've seen to date 0 Saw films. I think I put one of the Hostel films on one night with the sound off as I was reading late nights on a Saturday once, and they look like what you'd expect. And just there's very little ingenuity to them and very little cleverness to the filmmaking. That they rely more on the title. Yeah, the title suggests the extreme nature to the brutality of the killings in them. And I suppose Saw might have some clever gimmickry in them, how they set off some of the killings, but beyond that, it's
right.
There's not a lot of substance there.
But a lot of development and hacking people apart.
It seems a lot these days. The movies that become really popular is the ones that have the least amount of substance.
I know you can't deny that opening weekend from the teenage audience, but that's not for me. I'm not a teenager anymore.
Yeah,
and I'm not against savagery in cinema in general. Like I'll watch something if you're giving me something to hang it onto, but it just can't be there. Just
going back to Jaws,
just torture for torture's sake, right?
The death of little Alex Kintner in Jaws, the child, is a horrific scene to watch, and it's meant to be disturbing and have a profound impact on you. And it's not just there so you can be grossed out at all the blood and guts. And Spielberg has given you a great movie to hang that terrible killing on, whereas I have my extreme doubts that Hostel has anything other than the killings in them to hang anything on.
There's a film, a Canadian film called Martyrs, which deals with such extreme brutality, yet there is a point to it. There is something that I connected with. And for anybody out there who wants a really tough watch, Martyrs, but at least that film has something I can hold on to.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
It's a tough one. Do we want to talk about just some of the never-ending tropes of horror movies? Like, I'm personally tired of vampires, zombies.
If there's a new take on it, if it's done interesting, like last year we got a movie called The Girl with All the Gifts, and at least it was a little bit of a different take, and it treated the subject matter with a little more gravitas and care. It wasn't your typical zombie movie. I'm far more interested in seeing something like that rather than, like we always say, like The Walking Dead. How can you have a zombie sneak up on you in the middle of a field? Right.
Exactly.
Like something like that I don't have interest in, but if you've got a different take on it, I'm game for it. Like Ivan and I both like 30 Days of Night for vampire movies, and I like that because it treats the vampire as a predator. If I see a vampire movie, I want to see one where I'd be scared shitless if a vampire showed up.
Yeah, it's a terrific premise too.
That's one of the movies I really like, 30 Days of Night. So well done. Did you know he has 2 sequels?
No.
Don't.
31 days and 32 days.
No, it's still 30 Days of Night with some kind of subtitle, but just don't.
Okay. But back to zombies, though. We totally skimmed over George Romero.
Yeah.
And didn't talk about Night of the Living Dead or any of his subsequent ones. And Night of the Living Dead is still an absolute classic.
For sure.
And Dawn of the Dead is still pretty great. Still totally effective. But have you guys seen any of those?
Yeah. And I've even seen the remake that Zack Snyder did.
Oh, yeah.
And I really
that one's
like
pretty good too, as zombie movies go.
It's just because they overdid it, right? When Twilight, of course, made all these teeny boppers go crazy for vampires, so they tried to put vampires everywhere. Then with Walking Dead, they just went overkill on the zombies, and just something hits kind of the popular thing, and they just like try and bleed it to death.
I think I mentioned that in another podcast, how Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead were so gory, and they were almost endurance tests for me as a kid to see how much gore and blood you can take. And I think now it's just on
cable TV.
TV. Walking Dead has just as gory images as those movies did, if not more. And now, any child can just flip on and watch it and probably yawn.
Yeah.
Big deal. It's really amazing how far we've come.
Yeah, from what's allowed now to what...
Or how far we've
regressed.
Yeah, I don't know.
The zombies are eating it up.
Yeah.
And that's something where I'd say the source material is so much more intelligent and so much more worth investing in is the Walking Dead comic. The story takes new and different turns, and it's not as focused on the glamour of the gore that, I don't know, at times the TV shows tends to be. The comic is more focused on the characters and how the people are the Walking Dead. It's not the zombie. And
have you read the entire run?
I've got all the trade paperbacks that are available. And the characters are so much better in the comic than they are in the TV show. Like the TV show, I enjoy enough to keep watching, but I have severe issues with character and overall story arcs.
And you still watch it.
Yeah.
And the problems with the plot.
Yeah. Well, there's certain elements that work really well in a comic environment, but the minute you bring it to live action, it maybe doesn't work so well.
But then every once in a while you get something good like Zombieland, right? Which was fun, I thought. And then even when they did the whole zombie kill of the week and just discussing about different ways they've killed zombies.
We could do an entire show just on horror comedies, really.
For sure.
Of them. But yeah, we'll stick to the ones that actually scared us. But
yeah, that's true, because Zombieland was not scary. It was funny as hell.
Yeah.
That's another case of your investment isn't in the gore, your investment is in the characters in that situation.
Absolutely.
Just on the topic of zombies, I think one of the last, what I would consider a great one is 28 Days Later with Cillian Murphy, right? Like where you get just from the opening shot where Cillian Murphy's character opens up in a hospital bed and he's kind of wondering where everybody is because the hospital's silent, and he staggers out onto the streets of London, and it's a ghost town, and just even that image alone is jaw dropping to see just a completely empty London.
That's a terrific opening.
Yeah, I enjoyed the rest of the movie too, just his story of surviving and trying to find other survivors, and thought that was really good. I saw the sequel and I thought it was good. It was all right, but it certainly doesn't hold up to the first one by any means.
I agree.
And a couple of vampire movies, since we're discussing those. Another one that I liked was Shadow of the Vampire.
Oh yeah, that's a terrific.
Yeah, John Malkovich, Willem Dafoe, Carrie Elvis.
Yeah, that's
Carrie
a very
Elvis.
particular one. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just so well done. It was very character driven, story driven.
Right.
And
it's all about the creation of the classic 1920 film Nosferatu.
Yeah.
Directed by F.W. Murnau. And the crazy actor, I think its name's Max Schreck, who only appeared in that one movie. And talk about someone who just came to the movies and disappeared forever. And the whole movie kind of preys upon who was this guy.
Yeah, and the movie basically says that he's a vampire.
Yeah, it's great. Great performance by Willem Dafoe.
Oh, amazing. Another one that I liked was Fright Night.
The original?
Actually, I liked the remake.
I still haven't seen it.
I thought it was really well done with a good cast with Anton Yelchin, Colin Farrell, Imogen Potts. I'm not exactly Imogen Potts. Mm-hmm. Either way, really good. Colin Farrell, I thought, really did well as the main villain. He wasn't like crazy over the top, but just menacing enough. I thought it was quite entertaining.
Have you seen that, Paul?
No, I haven't. But just going back to what he had mentioned before, Shadow of the Vampire, that's another one of those movies that's been on my radar to watch and just haven't yet. So, but yeah, I actually
do that with Nosferatu. You can do a double bill.
I'm down for it.
Yeah, cool.
But yeah, I haven't seen either version of Fright Night. So
the original one is still pretty good. It doesn't take itself very seriously, but it was a lot of fun at the time. Kind of reminded me of Monster Squad. Do you remember that one?
Oh, I remember that. Yeah,
kind of tongue in cheek, but still good.
Not quite as tongue in cheek as Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Not quite. Another one is Lost Boys. Were you a fan of that?
Yeah, when I was a kid.
Yeah, that was another big one from the 80s.
I still really like the original for what it is. Like, I don't take it too seriously. It's just a fun vampire movie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I still like Interview with the Vampire.
Oh, I'm a big fan of that one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's very good acting, very good mood. Yeah, like, I know diehards for Anne Rice's books say that, you know, Tom Cruise isn't their vision of Lestat and whatever, but you know what? If you got an actor that can pull the role off, do it.
She endorsed him.
Yeah, and I thought he killed it.
Our first look at Kirsten Dunst and Antonio Banderas is so great.
Terrific in that.
Yeah.
The changes that she goes through, this child who's aged 100 years and still looks like a child. She's terrific.
Yeah. Looks innocent, but isn't. Mm-hmm. So
it's a very elegant horror film.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that one a lot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's one I've been meaning to revisit for quite a while and just haven't made it.
But going back earlier, how we were talking about Stephen King, I think one of his movies, The Mist, was really well done. And it was actually one of those movies where they changed the ending for the movie. And Stephen King came out and said he wished he thought of that ending because it was so much better.
In the original, they just drive away and it's fine.
I never read the book, so I don't remember exactly. Never looked into it, but in the movie,
it's a powerful ending. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next, if you guys will indulge me for a little while, I would like to leave Hollywood and talk a little bit about international horror movies. Many countries around the world have been making terrific horror movies for many years. I'd like to just briefly talk about a few of them. And I'd like to start with one country that makes great horror movies and had a flourish of them in the late 60s, early 70s was Italy, with directors like Mario Bava and Antonio Magretti and Dario Argento. They made these films called the Giallos. I don't know if you guys know of them. No. Like Suspiria and Opera, Inferno, The Bird with Crystal Plumage, Black Sabbath, Barren Blood, Kill Baby Kill, Deep Red. These are all pretty great.
Some of those titles sound familiar, but...
Yeah. Suspiria, they're doing a remake of it. It's coming out next year. They're all kind of very highly stylized and have a lot of blood, but they're much more elegant than the slasher films of the 80s. Yeah, I recommend them if we could do a whole show just talking about these. But that's one whole section of horror cinema that's kind of neglected a little bit, but the Giallos are fantastic, in my opinion. There have also been a lot of great Spanish horror movies lately, movies from Spain and, of course, Mexico, guys like Del Toro.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen Pan's Labyrinth?
Love that movie.
Yeah, fantastic.
That's a movie that pulls everything together. It's got that deep, rich Gothic feel. It definitely deals with the element of fear, but it's not just visual, but the story gets you, and it's so creative. I love that movie.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so well done. Just amazing.
Completely imaginative. And just when you think you've seen it all, Del Toro's comes up with something, bizarre images that you could never conceive of. The hand with the eyes. Still great.
Yeah.
He's made a similar film than that earlier. It's called The Devil's Backbone. It also deals with the supernatural during wartime. Not quite as effective as Pan's Labyrinth, but I recommend that one too.
And he's taking a year off from directing now.
I heard that. Yeah. The Shape of Water is going to be such a smash. I think he's just going to rest on his laurels for a year. He's been a busy guy for a long time. I think he deserves it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he just wants a break before he gets into all the other things that he has planned. So
yeah, I'm still hoping he can get financing for that In the Mountain of Madness, that H.P. Lovecraft.
And speaking of Del Toro, just after getting the Hobbit trilogy that we got, it's almost really too bad that he didn't make that trilogy. As much as Peter Jackson has identified with that whole franchise, it would have been really interesting and I think a lot more engaging to see Del Toro's take on the Hobbit trilogy. Yeah. That vision in that world would have been amazing, and it would have at least given it a different stamp.
And it would have only been 2 movies.
Yeah. Instead of dragging it out.
Yeah, that was a missed opportunity.
Not for the studio, because they made a killing.
Absolutely. It was going to be successful no matter what.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with you, Paul. Before we move on, I'll just name a few more movies from Spain over the years that I was a big fan of. Spirit of the Beehive is a terrific one from the early 70s. Who Can Kill a Child? Disturbing title, but it's a terrific one from the mid-70s as well. There's another one from just the turn of the century called I'm Not Scared, and one that Darren didn't think was too good, but I liked quite a bit. It's called The Orphanage.
Yeah.
But I would say for me, at least in the last 20 years or so, America has taken a backseat to horror and let a few other countries take over. Outside of American horror movies, I got to go for Japan. They did some great ones in the 50s, some of those classic Japanese ghost stories, usually involving someone wrongly murdered, like Onibaba and Kuroneko. Kwai-Dan.
Kwai-Dan comes to mind for me. I don't think I saw the first 2, but Kwai-Dan was very good.
Yeah, Onibaba is pretty terrific. And then, of course, just recently in the last 20 years with Ringu and Ju-on. And then there's a few other movies that I love from Japan. Takashi Miike's Audition, about the guy who's looking for a date. And he has a movie producer friend, and he decides to set up this fake audition. He can sit there and kind of pick which one girl he wants to have a relationship with. And that movie, I don't know if you remember where that movie goes.
Honestly, I don't recall it.
Oh my God, it's crazy. It's a tough 15 minutes to get through the end of that movie.
That's probably blocks it out of my mind.
Right. That one is terrific. Ichi the Killer is another good one from Takashi Miike. Yeah, for me, Japanese horror really, they're doing things in extreme ways, but it's so satisfying visually, and maybe it's just that foreign take on it.
It feels a little elevated beyond the torture porn of America, for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Some of those Japanese versions have done all right here, but for the most part, a lot of the stuff just doesn't translate well because what they get scared of over there, they really tame it down for American audiences.
Mm-hmm. I actually really like The Grudge. That's a movie that really stuck with me quite a bit, more than I thought it would be. And it just kind of creepy and just effective use of sound effects and overall, like we keep saying, mood, but you got to get the mood right to have any kind of effect. And I saw this in the theater with a coworker at the time, and we both pretty well versed in horror movies and both came out of it really chilled and really enjoyed it. So
yeah, I've seen both versions, The Grudge and Ju-on, the Japanese one, and they're very similar actually. They pretty much just changed the actors and the language, and so I always stick to the original Japanese if I can.
I don't blame you. I just didn't have access to it at the time, and I was in the theater and I was going with a pretty girl, so
right. That's another one of the great things about horror movies is they're great date movies.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I just find a lot of the times that for American audiences, they really tame down what made these movies successful in other countries. Mm-hmm. They take away everything about it that works. Although I did like Let Me In.
Oh, yeah, that's terrific.
Which was really well done, and they didn't really have to cut out anything, right?
The original one, too, Let the Right One
Let the Right One In, yeah.
Is fantastic, too. I recommend them both. Again, I'd stick to the original.
The original, of course, but still. But this is one of those occasions we can actually say, even if you watch the remake, you're not going to be disappointed.
That's actually one that's been high on my list of ones to see is Let the Right One In, and I still haven't had a chance to, so.
Yeah, check it out. And also Korea has
South
also
Korea
had some
too,
great
for sure.
movies,
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
They had a terrific one called The Wailing, came out last year. I highly recommend.
That's got some interesting and disturbing stuff in it.
The only reason I don't want to review it for the show yet is I'm not sure if I completely understood the ending of the film. I need to see it again, but that one is really good.
Yeah, I like it a lot. And the comedy that they worked into The Wailing too. I mean, it's such a dark, disturbing movie at times. And then there's the scene where the lead cop, who's just such a regular Joe everyman of South Korea, and he wakes up that one morning screaming the most horrific, bloody obscenities because of what he's going through. And then he looks over and, his daughter and mother-in-law eating breakfast like outside his bedroom door at the table. There's a lot of funny things in that movie, despite it being, it works as a good horror movie too.
Right. Yeah, lots of great international horror movies from all around the world. They're great. And anytime you can delve into another culture and kind of see what makes them tick, see what scares them, it's always fascinating to me. So yeah, lots of great horror movies from all around the world to check out. Paul, did you want to talk about anything in particular?
Have you guys seen Cube?
Oh, that's a great Canadian film.
Yeah.
Again, more science fiction mystery, but
and slasher as well, kind of survival.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that had what?
Slasher, Ivan, is more someone stalking someone. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. And just people being pegged off or dying.
Yeah.
There was what, 2-3 of those movies?
What, Cube?
Cube.
There were 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Again, I've only seen the first one.
Now I've seen all 3, and they never really explain
what's going on.
Yeah, what the purpose of this cube is.
The sequel's just a different group of people in the same cube.
They expanded a little bit.
Yeah, I think at one point there's like a control room, and then one of the guys in the control room ends up in the cube because he tried to help somebody wipe his brain and throw him in there or something.
I've only seen the first 2. I haven't seen Cube, but
again, a very minimal film.
Yeah.
I mean, the way that they're working with kind of just basically one set, but
very effective.
Another movie that I liked was that's kind of slasher with a different take was Identity.
That mystery one with John Cusack?
Yeah, John Cusack and Ray Liotta, Amanda Peet, Rebecca De Mornay. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those, you're not really sure what's going on until you can start figuring it out, and it becomes a slasher movie.
Half is a mystery, and then once the bodies start piling up, it kind of turns into a slasher film.
Yeah, so I kind of like that. It kind of has a slasher feel, but it also has a bigger purpose behind it, where it's not just slasher movie for the sake of a slasher movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I enjoyed that one too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked it.
Yeah, another one that I really liked was Brotherhood of the Wolf, which is kind of... Is it quite everything. Horror? Or, yeah, it's a bit of
martial arts,
horror, mystery.
Everything, kind of.
I forgot about that movie.
Yeah, but I really like that movie.
Yeah, that's a pretty wild movie.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't consider it a horror film, but
it has some of those elements. Once again,
it's
kind of
mishmash of tons of stuff.
But I thought he did it really well of putting it all together, though.
Interesting. One recent film that I know we're all a big fan of is Joss Whedon's Cabin in the Woods.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that movie. I think it's one of the best horror films of probably the last decade.
Have we talked about all those horror movie cliches? And this one uses all of them.
Right. It subverts what a horror film is supposed to be.
But that's the thing, though. You don't really realize it until later where they're using all these cliches as part of the story.
Mm-hmm. I love it. It's one of those things, like there's a couple of my favorite horror movies that actually have a humor element to it. Like I mentioned Ghostbusters earlier, Shaun of the Dead. Sure, they're dealing with a horrific circumstance, but there's that levity to it. I was not expecting the movie I got, and I was pleasantly surprised.
Mm-hmm.
This hits every beat. It's not too funny and it's not too dark. I think they strike the perfect balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably my favorite part of that movie is the two guys working downstairs, Richard Jenkins and Bradley Whitford, observing everything.
They have such a great chemistry, and
they're so good.
Pull it all together.
Right, and something we've never seen before. I thought that was just ingenious. These two so pedestrian, boring guys in charge of.
And Richard Jenkins has another great turn in a movie that is actually one of our first reviews on this podcast with Bone Tomahawk, which introduces some horror elements into the Western genre, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And he was a standout performer in that, and that was a really interesting watch.
Sure. And again, not a movie I would ever consider when I'm thinking of great horror movies, but you're right, it could totally fall into that.
Yeah. Really good movie.
For sure.
Absolutely. One other one that I really enjoyed from a few years ago, really creeped me out, was the Babadook.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, you saw that one?
Yeah, I actually borrowed it from you, I think, late last year. Mm-hmm. That's one that, it definitely landed with me. Just the investment in the character and the mother and the boy, what the Babadook could represent. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing I find about horror movies is that if you're going to have a monster and if you're going to reveal that monster, it better be worth seeing.
Right.
And I thought everything they did with the Babadook was great. Mm-hmm. And then I look at a movie like The Conjuring, and I really liked 70 to 80% of it. And the part that I didn't like was the part where they go that over the top horror movie and it just pulls you out of it. And I just think, man, you were doing so well.
Yeah, it fell on its face.
It sure did. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Babadook. I kind of forgot about it. But yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. Yeah. It's from Australia?
I think New Zealand. Terrific debut film from her. Really low budget, but what it has to work with, it does it so well.
Yeah.
You know what? One horror film I would like to talk about, Ron, that simply because it's very, very recent, is a film I've talked about before called It Follows, which made the #1 spot on my list of movies that year. I liked it that much. First of all, the idea that sexual promiscuity is something that leads to punishment. Yeah. It's an old trope of horror movies. Mm-hmm. And this takes that trope and builds it in such a way, takes such original stab at it. And then in so doing, creates a movie that, in terms of its this supernatural killer, the supernatural element of It Follows is so unrelentingly and blindly capable of a never-ending chain of death. It's so scary. And to wrap it all up in this just regular kind of Detroit urban atmosphere of these young kids and teenagers, I don't know. I think it's a masterpiece of horror. And
I love it too.
And I think that this filmmaker, whatever he's got coming up next, I really look forward to it.
Yeah, it's beautifully shot for one thing. And you're right. It never cheapens out. There's not a cheap moment in it.
No, it's tight and concise and a perfect horror film.
Of recent horror films, it's definitely one of my top favorites in the last decade.
That was a movie that I felt was a little more mood than substance for me. And maybe like I always say, horror movies are so subjective and they're so personal that sometimes you just have to be in the right mood to watch it. And if you're not in that mood, maybe it doesn't hit you. I watched it and I thought it was okay, but it just didn't land. And it's funny because I know The Witch was kind of like that too, where I know so many people that loved that movie and I thought it was all right, but it just didn't hit me. And maybe on a rewatch, which I know I say quite a bit, but yeah, they're movies that I appreciated and definitely something different, not your, copy and paste horror movies.
Were any of the three popular? We seem to be attracted to everything.
Yeah.
Everything that fails at the box office.
I think It Follows made a decent amount of money.
Yeah.
I think there's enough
Hopefully.
Element there that attracted it to the teenage crowd.
Good.
But the Babadook and the Witch certainly were not massive hits by any stretch.
Okay, well, I think we've maybe scratched the surface on the horror genre of almost 100 years of movies. Yeah, definitely a lot of our favorites. And if I had to pick one, my favorite movies, I always say The Shining is probably my favorite horror film.
I don't know what mine is, honestly.
I won't force you guys into coming up with one, but...
for me, hands down, Blair Witch.
Oh, yeah, right. We never even talked about that one, really, but...
We did a bit, but for me, it resonates with me because, again, it's that thing where it's just knowing how it was filmed was very interesting, and then just the fact that all the gruesome stuff happens in your mind, and that's just one thing of, like, whatever you're going to come up in your mind is far worse than what they could put on film.
And they did play up the whole, this really is found footage. These people were never seen again. And
one of the most effective marketing campaigns of all time, which led to the most successful film in the history of film. When you look at a cost ratio basis, it was a huge success.
Yeah, how little it cost versus how much money.
Yeah, it was right at the birth of the internet, and I don't think it could ever be duplicated quite like that again.
And it's one that for many years afterwards, out at my parents' property in BC, where you're surrounded by trees and late at night, you can't see very far around you. My hairs would stand up on end every now and again. And I actually wanted to see the original and I never did, but it was sued for taking elements from another low budget movie called The Last Broadcast, which had a similar premise where it was a group of students, it was a TV crew going out into the Jersey woods looking for the Jersey Devil, and similar thing where it was a found footage. And
really, it's amazing they didn't sue.
Yeah. They did, and I can't remember what the result of it was, if they settled out of court or what, but yeah, that's how I heard about it, is that they were suing the creators of the Blair Witch Project. And I haven't seen, sadly I saw the sequel to Blair Witch. It was an interesting idea that fell flat, and then
just watch the original if you're going to do it.
Yeah.
That much of a tried remake of it.
And I didn't see the new one that came out, was it last year?
Oh, that's the one I'm talking about.
No, there was an actual sequel that dealt with like the townspeople, and the movie actually existed in this realm. It was
Shadows.
It was an interesting idea, but watch the original.
Okay, let's wrap it up this time. I think we've exhausted the subject. Not exhausted. We could talk about this for another hour, but
we sure could.
Yeah,
time is precious.
Many, many hours.
Yeah, we'll promise we'll do the animation special soon. We just thought for Halloween we'll do the horror special. Much more fitting.
Absolutely,
definitely.
Yeah. Of course, next time we'll be back with the review of the new Marvel movie, Thor Ragnarok. We're all excited about that one. Until then, please subscribe and give us a rating on our Apple Podcast account. You can also follow and like us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like, you can also search for our past reviews and comment at our website at whywecmovies@libsyn.com. Take care.
So long.
Ciao, ciao for now.
Bye.